statements to cover the entire UFO phenomenon over the past 20 years.
Welcome to Total Disclosure, everybody. My name's Ty, and I am the host and creator of the show. We explore the mysteries of the unknown, from sightings to conspiracy theories. We dive deep into the unexplained occurrences in our skies and on the ground. If you're passionate about exploring the unknown and are intrigued by the possibility of extraterrestrial life, then you're in the right place. Don't forget, hit that like, subscribe, share button, follow. There's so many different platforms that it's different everywhere, but you know what to do. Leave a review if you're on Apple and Spotify. Today we have such a great show for you. Philp Mantle is back. Back to talk to us about the book that he was discussing with us last time, Beyond a Reasonable Doubt, which dives deeper into the Calvin Parker and the Pascagoula and the Charlie Hicks. The Pascagoula abduction case, with so much more testimony, witness testimony, evidence, and we're going to get him in here in just a minute to have him start going through that. But I do have some bad news as well. Tom Thompson, who is the co-host of the show, has resigned. He's leaving Total Disclosure to start his own show and to kind of lead his own thing. And we wish him the best. So Total Disclosure going forward is going to be one-on-one conversations, which is honestly the way I like it anyway. I tend to dominate conversations, and the co-host really doesn't get to do a lot. And I understand that, I can be like that. So we wish Tom the best in everything that he does. Everyone here at Total Disclosure wishes him well. And with that being said, let's transition and get Philip in here and start talking about this, because he sent me an early copy of the book and an audio version. And when I got into it, when I just cleared my head and got into this book, it started opening my eyes to the fact that this was not just the story that we had been told over and over again, right? There's so much more to it. There's that you wouldn't even imagine. So thank you, Philip, for coming on.
Yeah, my pleasure, Tyler, and nice to be back.
Yeah, it's not too long ago we had John, and so you're our first interview after Tim Burchett, which was a smashing hit. Getting to talk, I'm pretty sure that we're the first people to ever ask a sitting congressperson how they would handle the abduction phenomena if it were real in Congress. His answer: we couldn't. What do you think of that?
Well, it's interesting you should mention that, Tyler. I mean, if you look at all the hearings and the various chats on with Grush and others and so on, the abduction phenomena was completely edited out, so to speak. There was no mention of it whatsoever. I mean, Mr. Grush was allowed to say that people have been murdered to keep these secrets, but yet not once was the abduction phenomena mentioned. Now, I don't know if that's on purpose or it's just an accident. Am I getting a little bit paranoid?
I suspect it's on purpose.
Yeah, well, if we go back in time, when Betty and Barney Hill first stepped forward, a lot of researchers found it hard then to accept that these things were taking place. They felt it cast a shadow over the subject. They wanted to try and legitimize the subject, as they are now trying to redo it again. They're trying to reinvent the wheel. And Leslie Keane herself, when interviewed once about Mr. Grush and his statements, said that she purposely left out his comments about crash retrievals and so on, because she didn't want to over sensationalize it. She wanted to try and give it a degree of legitimacy. But, you can't do that. Whether you like it or not, the UFO phenomenon is part of the alien abductions is part of the UFO phenomenon. And that's it, so you can't edit it out. And it would be interesting if someone in the military, I've seen today that the new organization Arrow, All Anomaly Domain Research Office, has set up their own website.
Yeah, they're about as useful as a wet blanket, though.
Yeah, but they're going to have a reporting system. So somebody's going to have a reporting system somewhere. And it would be interesting to be a fly on the wall if somebody from a military viewpoint sent them a statement saying, look, I was abducted.
We already know that they did. So
Yeah,
Mario Woods is a good friend of mine. I talk to him on the phone all the time. And he gave 4 hours of testimony to Arrow. And, it didn't seem to raise any flags with them. And before we get into the Pascagoula case, to finish off on the sentiment, I think the government might be afraid to say that we might not be able to protect you.
Well, exactly. I mean, that's been, discussed, down the decades. If these things are real, then whatever the abduction, is, whatever lies behind it, whatever its natures and origin, then we have no control over it. Some people claim it's a psychological manifestation. It's something else. Whatever it may be, the fact is it happens to people at random, and it happens, and they have no control over it. It's like my first book I ever wrote. I co-authored it with a colleague of mine, and it was about abductions here in the UK, and we called it Without Consent, because that's exactly what happens.
Right. It's such a good that title hit the nail on the head, because again, we're dealing with something. Now, if you let's take the alien part out of it, right? Say someone comes into your house into the middle of the night, kidnaps you, takes you onto some vessel, does medical experiments on you, brings you back home. Is that legal or no?
No, exactly. It's not,
And we would lock those people away. If someone came forward and said, this guy abducted me in the middle of the night, but the word alien has this connotation to it.
Yes.
And
I mean, going back in years, Tyler, there was a colleague of ours here in the UK called Hilary Evans, long since gone as Hillary, but he wanted the abduction phenomena taken out of UFO research completely. He said it was like a tin can tied to a cat's tail, and he just couldn't do it. As hard as you may try, it's just not possible. So it'd be interesting to see how it develops, shall we say?
Well, I think we played after the interview. Burchett let something slip that we were the first ones to ask him about it, but he had been pondering it, and he has talked to abductees and on all of it, and he said that it's most likely he says that it's most likely happening, and that he can't see a reason why such credible people would make up such elaborate hoaxes and basically ruin their credibility with anyone of worth of anything. I mean, you could have a guy with schizophrenia and you tell him, hey, I got abducted by aliens, and he'll call you crazy.
Yes, absolutely. But it was a good question to ask, Tyler, because it's one that I've pondered myself. What is the official reaction? And you summed it up, and well done.
He literally he said nothing. There's nothing we could do. And this case in particular, so we have Betty and Barney Hill, the first real how do you want to say it, the first abduction that really went mainstream, right?
Absolutely, yes. It was the first
And,
one to hit the headlines. Yeah,
and it was, and people just, they were hooked. They were hooked by the story. They wanted to know more. People were showing up at their house, just wanting to talk to them. And then it went on and on and on. And then people, it just kept happening. And we kept hearing the same stories told over and over and over again with minor variations here and there. Then we come across this case, the Pascagoula abduction, which in my mind is one of the most credible, if not the most credible.
absolutely.
So what has been your I know that you reached out to Calvin Parker, and at first he was a little he didn't really want to talk to you. Not that he didn't want to talk to you, but he didn't want to write a book because that's what you were
He
asking
didn't
him.
want to talk to me either, Tyler. I mean, Calvin was rather like you're probably too young, but back in the 1980s, with a TV series called The Hulk, and the Hulk in human form, Dr. David Banner or Bruce Banner, I think they called him.
Yeah,
he was hunted by a journalist, and every time the journalist caught up, he would move on to the next town. Well, Calvin Parker did that in real life, not in a TV series. The event in question happened on October the 11th, 1973, on the Pascagoula River in Mississippi. Himself, almost 19, just got engaged with a new car, new job, and his colleague Charles Hickson, age 42, a veteran of the Korean War. Despite the age difference, the one thing that both guys shared was a love of fishing. So it was Calvin's first day out working in the shipyard. Charlie had got him a job, and he's driving home that night in his new car, and Charlie says, "Want to go fishing?" "Oh, yeah, great." They got the tackle at Charlie's house, stopped en route to buy some bait, and Charlie told Calvin to go because Calvin didn't know this area. His home was a couple of 100 miles away, and the plan was a lodge with Charlie Monday to Friday and go home on a weekend,
Right.
And so it was his first day at work. So, they drive down to this fishing spot. They pass a no entry sign, and Calvin comments on that. And Charlie says, "Don't worry about it. I come here all the time." So they set up fishing in one spot, and it's infested with insects. So they moved to another place, which is an old abandoned pier. There was a shipyard that had closed. It's an old little pier sticking out, falling apart. So there they go, rods in the water. I mean, I don't know what fishermen dream of when there's, they're not catching any fish, but that's what they were doing. And then these blue lights, in a little zipping noise, and these blue lights came from behind them. It went out across the water. So Calvin's first reaction was, shouldn't have ignored that no entry sign. It's the police. We're going to spend the night in jail for trespassing.
Yeah.
So both of the guys kind of turned around at the same time. And of course, it wasn't the police. It was an object shaped like, we call it a rugby ball. You call it an American football. And it was descending. It stopped a couple of feet from the ground. So it didn't touch the ground. It had two lights on one end. And Calvin said these lights were really bright, really blinding. Then this opening appeared and the light just intensified. And these three figures literally floated out. They didn't touch the ground again towards Charlie and Calvin. Two got hold of Charlie, one of Calvin. Described them as humanoid, head but with no neck. Instead of ears, there were these pointed protrusions out of the side and one out the front. They had long arms with pincer or mitten type appendages. Their legs never moved. They were just wedged together.
What?
Yeah, they were gray in color, but they had they call it the skin, but they don't know if it was the skin, but it was crinkled like an elephant skin.
Okay.
Charlie felt a prick in his arm. Calvin felt a prick, and they became relaxed, but they were totally paralyzed. The only thing they could move was their eyes. And these things took them to this opening. Charlie went to the right, Calvin to the left. Calvin says, "They put me on a transparent table." He says, I couldn't see it, but it held me up. And this creature, he called it the big ugly creature, stood in the corner. And then this thing came down from the ceiling about the size of a pack of cards, went around his head, circled around him, clicking, and then it went back up. And then Calvin said, I felt this presence. I heard a little noise behind him, but he said, I felt this presence. And this other being appeared, but this was a woman. She looked pretty much like, a woman.
Yeah,
Although,
he said, I'm sorry, I can't believe I just cut off Philp Mantle. Let me be struck down now. He had said in the interview I just listened to that if you had enough drinks in you at the bar, you might have asked this woman out.
Oh yeah, yeah. And the only difference was she had an elongated middle finger.
Right.
And she put this up into his mouth and up his throat, and it hurt. And it doesn't like talking about the next bit, but they removed his lower clothing. And Calvin says, they stuck something in my foot and it hurt. I'll come back to this later.
Okay.
And he said it felt as if they were sucking the blood out of me and replacing it with something else. He got this warm sensation going through him. And so they put his clothes back on, and then he managed to come round a little bit, and he got hold of this woman and smacked her head against the side. And then she sort of pointed at this big, ugly creature. It got hold of him again. He was paralyzed. Back out he goes onto the pier. Charlie had a similar encounter, although he didn't see any female creature. And the next thing Calvin knows is Charlie shouting at him, are you all right, son? Are you all right? Are you all right? And they both turn around, and this thing departs. It's gone in a flash.
They see it depart?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it was gone in the blink of an eye. And they had a discussion. Both men were traumatized by this event. Oh, they had a discussion. What do we do next? Now, Calvin, as I mentioned, had just got engaged. And he says, if this story gets out, maybe my future father-in-law won't let me marry, my fiance. So they agreed not to say anything. So they set off. They go to the car, which was brand new, as I mentioned. And when they got there, they opened the passenger door and the glass fell out of the window, shattered. Calvin got in, tried to start it. It took at least 20 attempts to start, whereas he'd never had any problem before. So they
it's a brand new car.
Brand new car. They set off to go back to Charlie's house. Charlie has a change of heart. He says, we got to tell somebody. He says, what if these things come back and do this to somebody else? What if it's the start of an invasion?
Oh, my God.
So reluctantly, Calvin agrees on one condition. He says, at the point these creatures grab hold of me, I'm going to say I passed out. And I don't remember anything else. You can tell him the story, Charlie. So Charlie agrees. It's his way of protecting his young friend. So they stop at a payphone. They have no money. They have no coins to put in the payphone. So
remember, a lot of people don't. It's like they hear the year. They hear
1973. Yeah.
Yeah, but they don't add the weight to it because remember, no cell phones, no internet, no nothing of that sort. You had to pay a nickel to make a call.
Yeah, well, the first place they called, Tyler, was Keesler Air Force Base, which is nearby. And they said, we're not in the UFO business anymore. Ring your local authorities. So they rang the police. And it was Jackson County's Sheriff's Department who was in charge of it. And they sent a patrol car out. First of all, they gave them a sobriety test, walk in a straight line or whatever. And then they escorted them into town. So both of them were in Jackson County Sheriff's Department with Sheriff Fred Diamond and his deputies. They were interviewed separately. And to be honest, they weren't believed. It's a crazy story.
It is. It's.
So what they did, they put them both in a room together, and there was a desk next to them, and then they left them alone. And one of the deputies came back a few minutes later, took something out of the desk. They had no idea what it was, but there was a tape recorder running in the desk. This became known as the secret tape. And when they played it back, they fully expected Charlie and Calvin to be having a good laugh. We
got him.
Yeah. But of course, quite the opposite. Calvin is crawling up the walls, literally. He's praying, he's almost crying, and Charlie's the same. I don't know how to make of it, son. Did you see that thing open? And so the law enforcement then had a change of heart. They then said, well, these something's happened to these guys. So they said, well, you can go home. So they said, well, please don't say anything, Sheriff. Please don't let the story out. And he said, no, I won't. So they went home, didn't say anything. They got up the next morning to go to work. Bearing in mind that was Calvin's first day working in the shipyard. And when they got there, they noticed there was a few more cars there than normal. And they were summoned straight to the boss's office. And he said, what the hell have you two been doing? The phones won't stop ringing. The story somehow had got out. And there were journalists there were people ringing. So Charlie and Calvin told their boss what had happened. And at some point, they were then sent to the Singing River Hospital for a checkup. They were fine. Then somebody said, what about radiation? Well, they couldn't check that at the hospital. So they said, you'll have to go to Keesler Air Force Base, which the night before, of course, they'd phoned and were told to get lost. So they were taken to Keesler Air Force Base. They were checked for radiation. They were clear. But guess what, Tyler? The guys that were in charge said, come and tell us what happened, gents. Come on. And they did. And what is good about that meeting as well is that they had a stenographer present who typed a transcript of the whole discussion, along with everybody's name that is there, all the Air Force people, and none of it's redacted. And we have, I think it's about 15, 16 pages long. So the full transcript is in the book. You can read it word for word yourself. And then, of course, Dr. James Harder and Dr. Hynek turned up the following day, and they conducted their own investigation, spoke to Charlie and Calvin and did various other things. And the following day, Hynek was going back home, and he held a press conference, and they said, these gentlemen are legitimate. Something bizarre has happened to them. So treat them with respect. And, of course, the media just went crazy. Calvin eventually went back home. So he'd only worked that one day in the shipyard. He said, I got hired, fired, and abducted in the same day. He ended up in the hospital with a little bit of a breakdown. He got married, and he actually joined the Royal Marines for a year to get away from it. Not a lot of people know that. He's not discussed that much, but he wanted to get away from the area. And eventually someone tracked him down in the Marines, a journalist, and, he came out with a discharge. But he wanted to avoid telling the story at all costs. He was severely traumatized by it. On the other hand, Charlie, who'd been in several large battles in the Korean War, handled it much better. He was quite happy to talk about it. He went on the Dick Cavett show and various other things, spoke at conferences down the years, would go and speak at the local church hall when they asked him,
Do you think that caused a tear in their relationship?
Well, they weren't really the best of friends. They were friends, but the two families had grown up in parallel. So Charlie knew Calvin's dad. Calvin was friend with Eddie Hickson, Calvin's son. So they were friends, but not the best of friends. And it did. Calvin would say, I wish Charlie would stop talking about it. I wish he'd just shut up. And he just wanted the story to go away.
Right. He was starting a family.
He got plans. He said he'd met his childhood sweetheart. They got engaged. So he wanted to get married,
right?
Get a house, have children, have grandchildren, a regular job, a picket fence, just a normal life. And on that one night in Pascagoula, changed his life forever. He became this man who roamed around. He even changed his name at one point. He used a false name. And he was doing a job, and they called him into the office, and he said, your name doesn't go with your social security number. So he got fired for that.
My God. And, so this just followed him everywhere he went.
Yeah, it was like an albatross, on his shoulder. And
And you made it great. The comparison you made with the Hulk is really good.
Yeah,
because it kept following him like the journalist followed Lou
absolutely.
Ferrigno. Yeah,
I mean, it was working in, I think it was Iowa, in the oil fields, and he went in the local, store to buy something, and the lady said, "Are you the UFO man?" And he thought, "Oh God, no."
oh,
But having said that, in the end, it kind of worked. And it took a long time, but it kind of worked out because in 2017, I got the permission to republish Charlie Hickson's book that he wrote with William Mendes. It's called UFO Contact at Pascagoula. Charlie died in 2011. So I thought, I wonder if Calvin's still alive. I couldn't find an obituary a bit for him. And I thought, if I can find him, maybe I'll get an interview. That's all I wanted, was just an interview, maybe put it in the back of the book to update things. And It took me a few months, but I finally found him, and I got a phone number, and I spoke to him. And he was very polite, but, didn't really say anything. But unbeknownst to me, just a few weeks before then, he'd been to the funeral of a friend. And as they were coming out of the church, he wrote in the book of condolences or whatever it is, and the people behind him saw his name, and then they're pointing and winking again, that's the UFO man. So Calvin's wife, Waynette, who'd been through, she was the lady he was engaged to right from the very beginning. She says, "Why don't you write a damn book and tell your story once and for all?"
Right.
And he says, "Well, yes, dear, yes, darling." No intention of doing it. And then, of course, a few weeks later, there's this strange sounding man from across the Atlantic phones him. And I happened to mention, that I published these books and I wanted an interview. And on the second occasion, I spoke to him. He said, "Well, I'm writing my own book." But he was just trying to give me the brush off, but being polite.
Right.
But I'd nailed him on it. I said, "Oh, you've started it, have you?" And he says, "Yeah." Well, so let me see what you've got. So he sent me it on email, and it was just some rough notes that he'd started.
Okay.
So I sent him a draft contract. I said, "Let me publish it." So we had a long conversation, and he said, "I'll write it on one condition." I said, "What's that?" He says, "You don't change anything in it. You don't edit
even if it's
he says, "I want people to know what happened to me, but I want people to know me, and my background and how this affected me." And so that's exactly what we did. And when the book came out, it was a success. It became an Amazon bestseller. Much to our surprise, we've no idea this was going to happen. And it kind of lifted this trauma from his shoulders because people now treated him with respect, including the vast majority of the news media. And he went to speak at UFO conferences and was amazed at the positive reaction he got from people. So it changed. And he said to me, "I wish I'd have done it years ago." So, well, none of us can go back in time. You've done it now. And we were up and running. And the story develops from there.
Right. So you've basically gone over, the story as we know it. Now, in the new book that you and Irene Scott have been working on, there's so much more to the case than anyone could have anticipated. So much corroboration and other evidence that is coming to light. And not just one witness, but 6 or 7.
Oh, there's more than that. I mean, I calculated the witnesses in the book from 1973 right the way through, and there's 40 witnesses in this book. There's 40. And that's a lot. This is the year. Yeah, you count them.
Yeah, it was 40. Yeah.
Because somebody asked me, and I didn't honestly know. I'd never counted them. So we knew that way back in 1973, there was a chap called Jerry Booth. He stepped forward. And there's a few old, TV clips of Mr. Booth, and his story was told. That appeared in Charlie Hickson's book. So we had a copy of that. And then what happened was when Calvin's book came out, I was contacted by a colleague who I didn't know from Greece. And he was called Stephanos Panagiotakis.
Oh, that's
a great name. Now, in 1981, so 8 years after the event, Stephanos was in the Greek Merchant Navy. but he was also a UFO researcher and writer, and his ship docked in Pascagoula. So he'd got a week's shore leave, so he set off to get an interview with Charlie Hickson, which he did. And he was directed to the police department, and they said, you ought to interview this other gentleman. He's called Pastor, he was a clergyman, Pastor Emmanuel Sigalis, and he's of Greek descent. So they gave him his address, and Stephanos literally went up, knocked on his door, and he got invited in. Now, Mr. Sigalis, or Pastor Sigalis as it was, said on the night in question, he says, I was with a chap called Broadhurst from the police and probation department in a car with a young lady in the back seat, a church volunteer, and we were heading to a church-sponsored meeting for people who had alcohol problems.
Yes.
And he says, as we're going out on highway, whatever, he says, this young lady's looking out the passenger side, and she sees this thing coming. And it goes right across the front of them, right across the road, heading in the general direction of where Charlie and Calvin were. Now, Stephanos went on that route, I think with Mr. Broadhurst. He took a photograph through the car window, had it developed, and had them draw the UFO on the photograph. And it's pretty similar to what Charlie and Calvin saw.
Now, did she say anything about the color?
Blue.
So she did nail down that color,
Absolutely.
the same color.
Well, let me just tell you what happened. So we have the interview that Stephanos did with Mr. Broadhurst. We have a transcript of it. He'd passed away. And so had Mr. Broadhurst. And we couldn't find the name of this young lady in the back of the car. And it was a colleague that helped us find it. And I think he found it in an old, obscure little newspaper cutting. And her name was Joanne Hallmark. Wow. So we set off to try and find her. And I found a couple of social media accounts that had long been abandoned. Hadn't been used in a long, long time. I left messages, but nothing.
Okay.
I went back about a year later, quite literally. We managed to get a black and white photograph of her. And I went back to this social media account and I noticed the name of a church. So I just literally copied and pasted that church into Google, and hey, presto, I found it. And the church even had a website, and it wasn't in Mississippi, it was in Maryland. And on the website were some sermons by two gentlemen called Hallmark. And I'm thinking, is that her husband or is it sons? So the church had a general email address, info@church, whatever.
Yep.
So I emailed them. I said, I'm looking for this Mrs. Joanne Hallmark. She worked with Pastor Sigalis in Pascagoula, Mississippi in 1973. If she's still around, could you forward my email on to her? I didn't mention anything else. And about 4 weeks later, lo and behold, she responded. And she confirmed, she said, yeah, I did work with the Pastor Sigalis in 1973. I was only there, I think, a couple of years, a year, whatever. So then I replied and said, well, this is what I really want to talk to you about. And it's what you observed that night of October the 11th, 1973. So she emailed me, phone number, the lot. I'd already started working with Dr. Scott because I'd published some of her books. And Irina was on board. And I passed the telephone number to Irina, and she phoned her. I got a full interview, and she confirmed seeing this thing. It went right across the road. The only difference between these two stories, she said they saw it coming back from the meeting rather than going to the meeting. But again, it's a minor discrepancy, which I would expect something of that nature when 50 years has gone past. If the story's all lined up absolutely perfectly, I would be more suspicious.
Suspicious, yeah.
Yeah. And she sent us a photograph of herself now, because I sent her the one I got, the old black and white one. And she's in the book, along with her old photo and a new one. Mm-hmm. So it was another corroborating. So we had that. And we thought, well, that's great. And then Calvin did a little, it's like a mini documentary news item for one of the local groups, news stations.
Right.
And it's about 8 minutes long. And eventually somebody, downloaded it, put it on YouTube. So I'm watching it, and there's all these comments underneath it. And I'm not one for going through the comments because there was so many.
Right.
But
Right.
I started going through them, and it learned me a valuable lesson. And I came to one, and it said, my mother and father were on the opposite side of the river that night, and they too saw the UFO. Now, it was a young lady that had done this, and she used her real name. And I found her on social media, and I sent her a message, explained who I was, and I said, would it be possible to speak to your mum and dad? And she said, I'll get back to you. Anyway, she come back. She says, yeah, they're willing to speak to you. And that was Mr. Jerry Blair, Mrs. Maria Blair.
That's right.
And they said, yeah, we were on the opposite side of the river that night. Jerry was going out on a boat. I think, the boat supplied the oil rigs and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But the boss was late. So he was having a sleep in the car and, a bit grumpy. And Maria says, saw these blue lights over the opposite side of the river. And it was moving around erratically, going up and down. She said, as if it didn't know where the hell it was going or if it was looking for something.
Right.
She pointed it out to Jerry. And he said, it's a helicopter, whatever. It was just grumpy, and I understand. So they decided to walk down this pier and put his belongings on the boat and wait for the boss to come. As they're walking along this pier, there's a huge splash in the water next to them. And Maria looks down and she said, there's a grey man in the water. Those are her words, grey man. And she's estimated this was around about 9 o'clock. She says this man went under the water and never came back up. They went up to the boat. She threw the stuff on the boat, terrified that she got to go back down this pier. And when she got to the car, it was 12 o'clock. And, so when I spoke to her, she was very emotional about it. And she says, Jerry saw it as well. And I spoke to Jerry and he called it the grey humanoid. But he didn't want to talk too much, And Maria said to me, I often wondered, Philip, if something similar hadn't happened to us, that like happened to Charlie. Yeah. And I said, well, what makes you think that? She said, I've got these impressions. It's almost like I can see something out of my peripheral vision, but I can't quite make it out. She got little flashes of things. So again, I passed the details on to Dr. Scott. She kept in regular contact. She interviewed Maria Blair, spoke to Mr. Blair. In 2019, there was an official historical marker placed at the site of the encounter. Jerry and Maria went to that, and the news people got a little interview with them, which I've put online. And again, Jerry's not saying an awful lot, but he told us he saw the lights, and he's and then he took ill. So this is a year or so after we first started talking to him, and I mean seriously ill. And out of the blue, he started to tell his wife that, well, we were abducted.
Oh my God.
And even though he was seriously ill, she was as mad as hell. And
Because
because he kept it to himself. He said, I was just trying to protect you. I didn't want people to think we were nuts. And he's literally in the hospital, about to have an operation the following day, and I get a phone call from them. You better tell Philip. So, and then Maria also did a little recording of him on her cell phone. And he sat on his hospital bed. He's still got stickers on him from having an ECG, you know, and he briefly goes over it. thankfully, he did survive his operation.
But he may have been thinking,
He thought he was
this
dying.
is
Yeah,
this is the only shot I have to tell the truth.
What it was like a deathbed confession.
Right.
And he lived a good while long, but not, he was really ill. And to his dying breath, Tyler, he was still telling his wife what had happened. And she was as mad as hell. So we documented all of that, and then last year, Mr. Blair had passed away a couple of years before. Maria mentioned the possibility of hypnosis, and we declined at first because we thought she was still pretty upset over her husband dying, and she mentioned it again. So I said, okay, if I can organize it, I will. Okay. And I literally contacted a number of hypnotherapists in the area, and one said, yeah. A young lady by the name of Crystal Slaughter. And she'd even come out, you didn't have to go to her. So we arranged for it to be conducted at Calvin Parker's house, because Maria had met Calvin and his wife Waynette, got to know them. Calvin had hypnosis before, so he knew what to expect.
Mm-hmm.
Now
he was hypnotized by Bud Hopkins, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
In '93, I believe.
We'll come to that. And what we didn't tell the hypnotherapist was the subject matter. Didn't tell her anything.
Oh, you didn't? That's right.
No, not a word. We just said October the 11th, 1973, in the evening on the pier. And she takes Maria back to that date and time. It's a contentious subject, is hypnosis. I know that.
Yeah.
But this is something Maria wanted. And she gets emotional. She can't find her husband. She talks about seeing these things. Eventually, she talks about them taking her eggs, and they're interested in DNA because they want to make children, but children that can walk among us and not be recognized. They'll just look like us. Oh, and you should have seen the look on the hypnotherapist's face, Tyler, because we actually had it filmed as well. So it's filmed by a professional cameraman, not somebody with an old video recorder. So we have it on film as well.
Where did that go?
Well, I have it here. It's just stored on my computer, and we just wanted to record it for posterity,
Okay.
And then recently, Maria did a telephone interview with a TV station here, and she talked about it again. She claims to maybe have seen these things, once more since that time, and make of it what you will. Make of it what you will. What is interesting, a few weeks later, we put Calvin under hypnosis. Same hypnotherapist. She now knew the subject. So I gave her a few questions to ask. And one of them was to ask Calvin, before anything starts, they stood on the pier with their rod and line, waiting for a fish to bite, just to describe what he can see in front of him. And he does. He says, there's the water. I can see this boat going out. He even tells you what type of boat it is. There's the road bridge with the cars going over. And right at the end, excuse me, he says, oh, I can see two figures on the other side of the river.
Holy shit.
Now, is that Maria and Jerry? Maybe it's a bit too far for that. Maybe it's somebody else, And if you weren't listening carefully, you would have missed that. But in the book, there is a full transcript of both of those sessions. And again, you can make up your own mind. Like everything else that's in the book, Tyler, you can draw your own conclusion.
Of course.
And we showed a clip of Calvin's hypnosis on a TV program here a couple of weeks back. It's in close-up. And somebody said, oh, he doesn't look like he's hypnotized. I can assure you he was. You can't see the hypnotherapist. She sat right next to him. We have another camera with a wide shot as well, but we didn't use that. And the hypnotherapist didn't take him back to relive it. She just asked him to tell the story, what he could remember. So there's different techniques in hypnosis. Whereas with Maria, she took her back to that night and that date and that time to relive it. And Maria was very emotional at times. She was crying. And, she's intimated that she might like further hypnosis, but we haven't said any more about that. We'll leave that for the time being. But again, all of this is in the new book. It's all there. And we were astounded. This happened over a number of years. But going back again, Calvin did a book signing in Pascagoula. I don't know what year, 2018, 2019. And a gentleman came up. I'll buy a book, Mr. Parker. Thank you very much. As he's walking away, he says, oh, I saw the UFO that night. Now, luckily for us, somebody was taking photographs. And here's this elderly gentleman with grey hair stood by Calvin buying a book. So we had a picture of him. And I eventually put it on social media. I didn't say what. I just said, we'd like to speak to this gentleman if anybody knows him. And then I think it was a lady from the local library contacted me. She said, I know who that is. I said, well, can you ask him if he'll speak to us? I explained what we wanted, what we're looking for. And she come back and said, yeah, I'd love to talk to you. And his name was Mr. Lewis Lee. And again, Tyler, he was on the other side of the river that night, working in the shipyard, this time as a crane driver. Oh. And he said, Philip, when I got in my cab, which is about 10 feet off the ground, you have a great view. And he said, I looked out over the river, and he says, this is the darndest thing you've ever seen. It's there over the river. And he watched it for some good length of time, Tyler. And the only reason he took his eyes off it is because his friend down below is shouting at him, what the hell are you doing?
Right. Right.
And when he turned back, it had gone. So I said to him, Mr. Lee, did you tell anybody about this? He said, who the hell am I going to tell? So you can't phone Ghostbusters. This is not. He did. He said, but I told my wife and family, he said, I didn't keep it secret, but there was nobody to tell.
Right.
And I said, how are you sure
it's lights over a river at that point,
Yeah, I said, how do you know it's the same time as Charlie and Calvin? He says, because I saw them two on the news. A news story about it. So I knew it was the same date. Sadly, Mr. Lee passed away this year. So there's a memorial to him in the book. And that was just, another gentleman called Mr. Anderson, Charles Rusty Anderson. Back in 1973, one of the criticisms were that nobody driving over the bridge said anything.
This is what I wanted to bring up.
Doesn't mean they didn't see it. Well, Mr. Anderson was one of those people driving over the bridge that night with his wife. And he said, I saw this whitish blue thing down below me, Philip. So it's down below. And he said, I thought it was going to crash. It was that low,
And that close?
Yeah. And he said, I think it was either the next day or 2 days later, he went to see a relative who lived down by the river. And they said, you never guess what I saw the other night. And he says, I know what you saw. I saw it too. Now, we've been, this is a good example of how things work, Tyler. We've been making a documentary. It's all filmed. It's in the editing stage now. It's with a British company. They were out in the States last year filming, and they filmed an interview with Mr. Anderson. And he put a little comment on Facebook, just being interviewed. And there's a few comments. And there's a lady leaves a comment. She says, oh, I saw that thing that night. So I contacted her. She's in the book. She's called Pamela Rayleigh Eves. And she said, I was putting the children to bed, and I went to close the bedroom curtains, which looks out across there, and I see this blue thing, So it's not a major sighting, but it's another sighting. The interesting part is, she's the cousin of Mr. Anderson. She didn't know he'd seen it, and vice versa.
Yeah.
So they were cousins, and they'd never spoken to each other about it. That was the first that they knew. And it's another sighting, by another person that night, and on we go,
And it goes to show you this is the fact that these two people related didn't know that each other saw the same thing or even saw something in general, because people are so afraid to talk about this thing.
Yep.
They're so afraid of the stigma and the ridicule that comes along with it that they'd rather shove it into the back of their brain and really just not talk about it or think about it ever again.
Well, they saw how Charlie and Calvin were treated in the news media. I spoke to one gentleman who saw something a few days later, and he said, I used to watch two particular channels. One of them was kind of serious about it. The other one was just making fools of them. So he said, then there's no way I was going to tell them what I saw, in case they make a fool of me.
Right.
But he told Calvin, he went to Calvin's house and told him, all these years later, because when Calvin stepped out from behind the shadows, he was treated with respect. And the news media treated him seriously. And so it encouraged people to come forward. Plus, a lot of them are at that age now, Tyler, where they couldn't care less what anybody says anyway,
Right.
And Calvin always said, look, I don't care whether people believe me or not, as long as they don't call me a liar. Now, what is interesting about the way they were treated, just this month, earlier this month, a lady by the name of Chelsea Norton Prince, who runs the Ocean Springs Historical Society in Mississippi, was donated 2 boxes of letters that used to belong to Charles Hickson. The lady that had them, her mum and dad, bought Charlie Hickson's house in 2011 when he passed away. And these things were just lying in the house.
Oh.
And she had a lot more, but she'd given away. But she remembered these 2 in the garage. And Chelsea had an interest in the case. She said, oh, do you want them? Oh, yeah. The next day, she contacted me, and she digitized every single thing in it. And there's one particular letter addressed to Calvin. And it's a married couple, and they are apologizing on behalf of everybody else in America for some TV show they've seen where they cut Charlie and Calvin off and were laughing at them. And she's apologizing for that. So even back then, people realized the ridicule and the stigma. But now it's kind of changed. And there's no smoking gun in these documents, but they are a snapshot in history. There is a pencil sketch by Charlie Hickson of the UFO. Nobody's ever seen it. There's some photographs. There's letters from Betty Hill.
Oh, geez.
Because they both met Betty at different times. And there's people reporting their own sightings. Interestingly enough, a lot of people just wanting more information. And that was Calvin's drive as well. He wanted to find out what the hell had happened to them that night. So it was a quest for answers in that respect. And I promised him that I'd do all I could to try and help answer some of those questions if I could.
And that's the thing.
Yeah.
That's the thing is with this phenomena, and I say phenomena because there's just many, but with the UFO abductions and everything, I mean, I can't imagine how that would feel, to have that happen. And then, for years of ridicule, people telling you it didn't happen, you made it up, you're crazy, you're this, you're that. And then all of a sudden, the New York Times article comes out, right? The government starts taking it seriously. There's hearings going on, and people are like, oh, wait, what?
Yeah.
Like, this is actually real?
Yeah. Well, when the book came out, some people were saying, well, anecdotal evidence, eyewitness testimony, it's just a story. I said, well, let's not forget, you can still use eyewitness testimony in a court of law,
and put someone away for their whole life.
I said, but it's not just eyewitness testimony in the book. Now, when I first started working with Calvin, when he was literally writing this first book, I said, have you got any photographs, documents, anything? And he said, no. He says, our house was hit by Hurricane Katrina. We were under 10 feet of water. Everything's gone. So I said, okay. So I said, what I'll do, I'll start for a search, because we literally started with nothing. So I thought, well, who was around at that time? Obvious place to start, the Center for UFO Studies. Hynek had been there. You know, and Calvin kept in touch with Dr. Hynek down the years. He'd ring him every now and again.
Right.
So I contacted the Center for UFO Studies, and they said, yeah, we have a file on it, Philip. They sent me a PDF file, mostly newspaper cuttings, not any great material in it. But right in the middle of this stuff, Tyler, is a letter. It's typewritten, and it's entitled Puncture Wounds. And it's dated October the 13th, 1973. So it's 2 days
Holy
after the
shit.
event. And it describes both gentlemen, Charlie and Calvin, stripping down to their underwear and being given the once over.
Right, right.
And it goes on to say that puncture wounds, in inverted commas, were found in Charlie Hickson's forearm and Calvin Parker's foot. Now, if you remember right at the beginning, when we were relating this, Charlie felt a prick in his forearm, and Calvin, whilst on board this thing, said they removed his lower clothing, including his shoes and socks, and they stuck something in his foot, and it hurt.
Wow.
So and it mentions in this document, and here's the photographs, but there was no photographs in this file. So I said to Calvin, who the hell checked you over? And he said it was Dr. James Harder. Harder wasn't a medical doctor. I think it was doctor of engineering, but at least he had the foresight to do that. Anyway, so we got this document. It was fascinating. And again, I don't know how long afterwards. It was a good long time afterwards, Tyler. The same gentleman at QFOS who sent me that file emailed me and said, Philip, I've been rooting through some files today, looking for something else, but I come across something. I'm sure you've got these anyway, but I thought I'd better send them just in case. And hey, presto, they are the photographs of Charlie Hickson's forearm and Calvin's Parker foot with the so-called puncture wounds in them. And we know who is who. The heads are not on them because these are photographs. And on the back of them is the name of
who it is.
Of who it is. So we have, some people say, well, anecdotal evidence is not good enough. So we have Charlie and Calvin talking about feeling these minor injuries, and they were only minor. Then we find a typewritten letter from 2 days after the event describing these minor injuries. And then, hey, presto, we have the black and white photographs of the minor injuries themselves. So we don't just have anecdotal evidence. We have some physical evidence that there was a physical element to whatever happened that night,
Yeah.
And again, it's all in the book, including the photographs, and the document. It's all there for everyone to see. And again, make their own conclusions, Tyler.
Now, Calvin mentions that he had clothes, the clothes that he wore that night. He got home eventually and stripped it, took a shower, bathed himself in bleach, and then took the clothes and threw them in the dumpster.
Absolutely.
Why wouldn't the police have asked for those clothes?
Who knows? I mean, put yourselves in the police shoes. You're used to muggings, robberies, gunshots. Who knows? You're trained how to deal with that. And then you get a phone call one night. Two guys said we've been abducted by aliens. There is no training for that. And what is interesting, I didn't mention earlier, the police dispatcher who was on duty that night, who took Charlie's phone call, he's still alive, and we've been in contact with him. And he said, I took over 50 calls that night of UFO reports. And he said, when I went back to the station, there were people there in person reporting it, including a pastor. Was it the pastor Emmanuel Segalis reporting it in the police department? I don't know. But it's curious, isn't it? It can't be that many pastors reporting, UFOs that night.
Right,
and of course, Stephanos interviewed him 8 years later. And he was given his name and address by the police. Go speak to this guy, you know. So it's confirmation in it, possibly. And we found just before we finished the book, we found a newspaper cutting where Sheriff Fred Diamond is interviewed a few days later, and he said he'd seen something himself a couple of days afterwards. And he said they'd had thousands of calls, you know, across the states, you know, all neighboring counties and states. And that's true. You know, in fact, there's a book called, you know, 1973, The Year of the Humanoids. And, but, you know, I don't know where to stop. So we don't just have eyewitness testimony. We have this physical evidence as well. We have the secret tape of their conversation within hours of it happening. We have their typewritten statement the day after at Keesler Air Force Base, written by a stenographer. So these weren't, you know, statements that were taken down 20, 30 years later. They were done at the time. You know, you can't get any. See, we mentioned Betty and Barney Hill, but the Hill story didn't come out until years later. They have no independent eyewitnesses, no real physical evidence to speak of. You know, same with Travis Walton in 1975, I believe.
Yeah, 70. Yeah.
You know, he was with his colleagues at the time in the truck when they stopped in the woods, but there is no other UFO sightings of any note. Certainly no independent eyewitnesses, and so on and so on, you know. But with this case,
it's just overwhelming.
There is a bit of everything, you know, and another thing we haven't mentioned, there's two gentlemen in the book called Caldwell.
Yes. Oh,
yep. There's Clay Caldwell and Russell Caldwell. They are not related. They are not related at all. Clay Caldwell told us, he said, he was 11 years old at the time. Now, bearing in mind, it happened on a Thursday night. So Friday, it comes on the local news. He's 11 years old. And he says, on a Saturday morning, my parents used to have a sleep in. Used to have a nice lying bed after a hard week at work. And I was allowed to sit downstairs on my own and watch cartoons. But he said, what I did, he said, I got on my bicycle. I went and got a couple of my friends, and we set off to try and find the location where this thing had happened. And right next to this site is the grass is, you know, 5 or 6 feet tall.
Okay.
And he said, we're wandering around inside this stuff. We're having to push it apart. And he said, we come across this clearing, and every bit of vegetation is gone. It's not been squashed. It's not been burnt. It's just not there.
It's disappeared. It didn't exist.
Yeah. And then there's another gentleman called Caldwell, Mr. Russell Caldwell. He was in a car driving over the bridge. I think at the time, he's about 15 or 16 years of age. And he said he looked down and he saw what looked to him like a piece of this had been, you know, removed. And he said he was sure a few days later it had been plowed over. So we have two different witnesses saying that they may have seen some ground markings or not. Again, we've put their testimony in the book so you can judge for yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's you know, it's fascinating, and it continues to grow, Tyler. You know, it does. It really does.
And this, you know, it amazes me that there are so many people, and the theme remains the same among all of them, that there's these blue lights. They're acting very erratic, right? They're buzzing, right? They're doing things that you wouldn't expect lights or like a plane or anything like prosaically to do. And yet, none of these people come forward at the time because they see how.
Well, one did. One did.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yeah. But most just kept it to themselves until much, much later, because do you think this case would have been a lot different if all these people had come out at the time?
Absolutely. But again, some people have said to me, oh, well, these people are just looking for their 5 minutes of fame. So what you've got to understand is some of these people didn't come out. We found them.
Yes.
Like
You
Joanne
didn't
Hallmark. They didn't cheat. We tracked
searched
her
her
down.
out. Yeah.
Mr. and Mrs. Blair didn't come out. It was their daughter that made that little comment on YouTube. Had she not made that comment, we would probably never have, heard of them.
Mhm.
And it's like when Mr. Caldwell made his remark on Facebook about being interviewed for a documentary, a lady left, one sentence. That's all she left, a comment. And I had, amongst a lot more comments, Tyler, had I not seen that, again, we would never have got to speak to her.
Right.
And like I said, when I saw that first one on YouTube, it taught me a lesson. No matter how long it takes, if there's an item online that's new about the case, and there's a lot of, comments below, have a bit of patience and try and go through them. You never know what you might find.
Oh,
And
yeah.
yeah, and that's worked well for us. And then we have sightings a couple of days before and a few days after. The one a few days after, for me, is fascinating. It happens on November the 6th, if my memory serves me correct. So it's 3 weeks later. It's in the same part of the Pascagoula River, just a little bit further out where the water's a little bit deeper.
Okay.
And there are 4 little boats, 4 little skiffs. It's 2 families go out in these boats with their nets, and I think they're fishing for mullet. And they spot something under the water.
Again, under the water.
It's circular. It illuminates. It's a whitish color, a bit off-white, and it's separated into segments. They described it as looking like an old Second World War parachute, where they were segmented.
Yeah.
And they got that close to it, Tyler. They took an oar and hit it, and it went clunk. The lights, yeah, absolutely. The lights went out. And then it would reappear somewhere else. So they're playing cat and mouse with this thing around the river. Eventually, they made their way to the Coast Guard station in person, told the Coast Guard, and the Coast Guard sent their boat out, and they saw it.
Oh,
and they hit it with an oar, and it went clunk.
So this is a physical object.
It's a physical object under the water.
In the water.
And, the Navy sent a guy out. In the book, we have all the Navy documents, and in full, again, with all the names of everybody involved. And in these documents, the Navy says, that the object remained unidentified. Now, whilst working on the book, a colleague said to me, speak to so-and-so. I think he's got a photograph of all those civilian witnesses of that thing under the water. So I contacted him. He said, yeah, I've got one. Yeah. And he sent me back this colour photograph. What the Coast Guard did, or the Navy, they lined all the civilian witnesses up on the quayside, took a colour photograph of them. And on the back of the photograph, again, put their names and their ages. And they're also mentioned in the document. It says photograph of principals. And they made a cassette tape recorded interview. We've never been able to find that tape, but we had this photograph. I think there's 7 men and 1 woman. And again, put it on social media. Within a couple of hours, Tyler, a lady had contacted me and said, she says, I know them all. I know every single one of them. But they're all deceased.
You luck out.
They're all deceased apart from one.
Oh. And
I think he was a relative, an in-law of some description.
Okay.
And in no time, we had his name. He's mentioned in these documents, and he's mentioned on this photograph. His name was Earl Ryan. He was only, I don't know, 15 or 16 at the time. And we had his phone number. Somebody gave us his phone number. 2 days later, Irene is on the phone to Mr. Ryan, and he tells us the whole story again, and he said,
Mhm.
since that day, I think he did one interview for the newspapers, and he said, nobody's ever asked me again. And he says, the Navy did send a guy out, and he said, we went out into the water with him, and he's saying, well, where did you see it? And he thinks this Navy guy's an idiot, because all you can see is water. There's nothing there. It's just water,
Right.
And there was rumor that the Navy were going to issue a report, but we've never been able to find one. So I assume that nothing came of it. But in these documents, it's the Naval Ship Research and Development Laboratory, Panama City, Florida. So it's a memorandum stated the 12th of November, 1973. So it's only a few days after the event happened.
Mm-hmm.
And they say, they could not identify what this thing was. And it's not any fish, it's nothing.
Did they send any divers?
No, because the water's not that deep anyway. I think it's only like 6 to 8 feet deep, because these were only little skiffs. They weren't the huge, great big boats.
Okay,
no,
okay.
There was nothing. No,
but this thing could be in the water at that shallow of a depth.
Yeah. Now, people have said to me, well, that happened, some days after the Pascagoula event. Therefore, it's got no connection to it.
That's not true.
I tend to disagree. It's in the strange stretch of water, literally.
How is it? Yeah, it's on the same river, and it's under the water where an abduction took place. Maybe multiple.
Yeah, interestingly, Tyler, in this naval document here, they actually use the phrase USO.
Oh my God.
Yeah. It says the nature of the UFO sighted on the 6th of November in 1973. So that's their phraseology, not something the witnesses are saying. They're using that terminology. And they say it's like no fish or marine animals or,
Right, because we do know that there are fish that light up, that have that ability to do such things. But from what the witnesses are describing, it doesn't add up to that, like that in a shallow river like that. There wouldn't be those types of fish anyway.
Yep. And he says it right at the end, it remains unidentified. That's it. But I'm sure there may well have been an internal report that never got published or something like that. I've made attempts to try and track any information. He mentioned a cassette tape, of the witnesses being interviewed. I've not been able to locate that, but it may be discarded. Who knows? But we have the documents. We have official press releases that went out. We have a drawing of the thing they saw, and we even have a handwritten letter by one of the crew on the Coast Guard boat that night, a letter written on the 13th of November, 1973, to the long since gone UFO researcher Leonard Stringfield. So the letter is in the book. You can, look at it and try and make out what it says, but it is there. And in that letter, there are drawings of this thing that they see under the water. And, make of it what you will. It baffles me. It really does. But all the documents are there as well. There's nothing redacted. Everybody's name is there. So if you want to go and do some digging on your own, there's nothing stopping you. The information is there.
So you titled this book Beyond a Reasonable Doubt. I'm going to straight up ask you, in your educated opinion, did the Pascagoula abduction happen?
Absolutely. I mean, Irina and I were toying with ideas for the book, and we had another title originally, but it was only a working title. We even had a cover done with the working title on it. And then I was watching a TV show one night about a courtroom drama type thing, and it said, beyond reasonable doubt. In other words, they could prove this thing beyond reasonable doubt, that this guy was innocent or he was guilty. I can't remember which way it went.
Yeah.
It works both ways. So that phrase hit me. And I said
And you
to
were like,
Irene,
"That's it."
Irina, I'm confident if we took all of this data and all of these witnesses into a courtroom and they presented the evidence, we could prove beyond reasonable doubt that something extraordinary took place that night. Well, we'll never be able to prove they've been abducted by aliens. That's not going to happen. But we could prove that something bizarre happened that night. There is no rational, conventional explanation that I can find that would account for all of this information.
Right. For this dozen
everything. It has to account for every last bit of it. Some people, one guy said, "Oh, it's mind control experiments by the U.S. military." I said, "Well, how the hell did they know they were going to be there that night?" Calvin had only recently moved there. He was only living. It was his first day working there.
Right.
Another guy said it was a similar type of experiment, but the aliens they saw were robots. But U.S. military robots. And I said, well, again, how the hell did they know they were going to be there that night? They only chose to go there on the way home from work.
Because of the gnats at the other location. They could have been at a whole entirely different spot.
Absolutely. And people have to remember the location where this is. It's all been cleaned up now. It's all trimmed back, but it was a bit of a dumping ground in those days. It was, but it wasn't this. We're not talking about out in the Mississippi swampland somewhere here, Tyler. This is right next to Highway 90. The bridge goes right over the river. There are small boats coming in and out, bigger boats going in and out. Mr. Blair was getting on a boat. His job was to service the oil rigs out in the Gulf. With supply. That's what he was doing. He was going to be away for a few days.
This was a heavily traveled route.
Absolutely. So if you're trying to conduct some kind of military experiment, it's a very dangerous place to do it,
right?
Because, collateral damage, literally. And you had no idea that Charlie and Calvin or anybody else was going to be in that location that night at that time. And that wouldn't explain for the physical marks or the other eyewitnesses, the things that happened before, the things that happened after, and the whole wave of sightings that happened across the United States. What we've done in one chapter, to give you an example, Tyler, I read a newspaper cutting. One of the main UFO groups there at the time was NICAP, the National Investigation Committee on Aerial Phenomena. The head honcho is in this newspaper, I can't remember his name, saying we've been inundated with calls since the Parker and Hickson encounter, broke.
Right.
Now, the NICAP files are held by David Marler at the National UFO Historical Records Center in Albuquerque.
Okay.
So I contacted David and I showed him this newspaper cutting. I said, can you just at random pick some NICAP files out that come after the Parker and Hickson date? And he did. And they just picked them out at random. They're all in the US. And he digitized them for me and sent me them. And there are sightings here, there, and everywhere, Tyler. So it's not directly related to what happens in Mississippi, but it shows you what was happening elsewhere across the United States. And it seems when you look back on it, it seems that whatever happened in Pascagoula that night, that was the epicenter. That was the peak. Things were coming and coming and coming. They built up to a peak and then they ebbed away again across the United States. Now, I'm another thing we haven't mentioned. And again, I wish Dr. Scott was here because she could explain it better than I.
I know.
She's a scientist. She's got PhD, all kind of stuff. She's got a very long
very
CV.
Smart woman.
Yeah,
very smart woman.
And I'm very fortunate to be working with her. Now, on that night of October the 11th, 1973, Irina lives in Ohio on the old family farm, but she was 600 miles away in Missouri, studying for her PhD. So again, this is October the 11th, 1973. And her mother phoned her. And she said, have you heard that noise? She said, what noise? She says, there's been this huge sonic boom. It's even cracked one of the windows in the barn. So she spoke to her mother about it a couple of days later, and her mother said, there's these UFO sightings all over the place. Irina knew nothing about this. Not a thing. Did not know it's the night of the Pascagoula case. She didn't know anything about it. A few years later, her curiosity was pricked again about this sonic boom, and it was in her scientific head. She started to look into it. And she started off with the most rational explanation. Could it have been a jet aircraft? Now, because she found out that the sound wave from this thing was 1,000 miles long and 500 miles wide. It was that big.
Jeez,
She spoke to seismologists, found newspaper cuttings about it, and she could not track down a source for this boom. Dr. Scott is convinced it is the second loudest noise ever recorded on Earth. The first one was the Krakatoa volcano that blew up in 18 whatever, whatever. And this is the second loudest, and it was huge. Now, we're not saying it's connected to Pascagoula. All we're saying is it happened on the same
same day. I mean,
and Irina was phoned about it,
there's a degree to which someone could believe in coincidences, right? But there's just too many here. There's just too many.
Well, Irina will give you an example. A normal jet aircraft at a normal height, when it goes through the sound barrier, you get a sonic boom. You hear that in about a 2-mile radius. The higher in altitude it goes, the less the noise goes, because the atmosphere is that much thinner. You need atmosphere for sound wave to spread.
Yeah.
This thing, and the reason she knows the date is because she got the newspaper cuttings that were there at the time. They told her the date of it, and it was the same night. This covered an area of 1,000 miles long and 500 miles wide.
So how big would that have to be?
Well, exactly. There was no meteor impact, no satellites decaying. Again, they wouldn't make that kind of noise anyway. It wouldn't be so big, and she can't find any explanation for it.
Wow.
Again, it's in the book. We haven't gone into it in huge depth because we didn't want to, blind people with science, but it's there in the book. And again, take it on board or dismiss it. It's entirely, up to you. But we would be foolish not to include these things in the book, because if somebody found out, they say, why didn't you put that in? You're cherry picking what information you put in the book. No, we're not.
Nope.
We put everything, and you got an early edition of the book, Tyler. I think it's changed a bit since then. Not to a huge amount, because we got other information in. And the beauty of digital publishing, of course, you can update the manuscript and then upload it again, and it just replaces the old one. Whereas in, the conventional days, when you print 5,000 books and they're scattered to the four winds in bookshops, once it's printed, there's no change.
It's printed, baby. Yeah.
So, little things are still coming forward, but the book is out now. So we drew a line in the sand and said, right, we're not going to change anything else. It's like I said, Mrs. Blair was interviewed on the television here the other night, and I have a transcript of the conversation. I could, if I wanted, put that in the book. I could update it again, but I said, no, we'll publish that conversation later elsewhere.
And I want to ask you about the documentary. So with the documentary, now, is the documentary going to be, is it meant to bolster the book, or is it meant to run parallel?
No, it's I've been working with a production company here called Entertain Me Productions, EM Productions, for a few years now. And the first time they came here was to film a little spot for a TV show, I think, and I always make sure I have a couple of books at hand. And I gave them a copy of Calvin's first book. I said, here's a story for you guys. you know. So at this time, it's very early. We just got Calvin's book out. And they said, oh, thank you, Philip, you know. And off they went. And we kept in touch and we worked on a number of other things. And of course, I kept them updated with the way things were developing with the Pascagoula case.
Yes.
And eventually they came up with an idea for a documentary. Then COVID came. So it was put on ice. COVID, we're back out. We're allowed out again, and they renewed, they renewed their interest, which I thank them for. And of course, even during COVID, we were still getting information. And I said, well, since the last talk to you, we've got this and this and this and this has happened. So eventually, we signed a contract. We signed a contract. We didn't have any new book in mind at that time. It was pretty much based on Calvin's 2 books himself.
Okay, yeah.
And then all the other stuff kept coming in that we couldn't ignore. And so, well, we're going to put this in a new book, you know, but you can still have the information. It's not necessarily in Calvin's 2 books, but it's here. Literally, as the producer is flying from the UK last year to the States to start filming, we tracked down a police officer who saw something a couple of days afterwards. And he actually reported it to NICAP, but a few years later. So we had his name. And again, I just posted his name on social media to see if he was still around. And hey, presto, he's still alive. And we got an interview with him. He's called William Gennaro, Pascagoula Police Department, retired. And he was out on patrol about a week later. 5 days later, he saw something.
Oh,
so I said, will you speak to the crew? The comment that they're on the way now to make a documentary. And he says, yeah, sure. And so I'm emailing them saying, here's last minute. Here's a guy here I think you should interview. And of course they did. And he's in our book as well,
Good.
So things, yes, they started with Charlie and Calvin's book and it developed. From what they've told me, I have no control over it, by the way. We just part of it. And they say that it's almost like a whodunit. We're going to they've interviewed Calvin, they've interviewed Waynette, they've got archive interviews with Charlie Hickson. They interviewed his son Eddie, plus a number of these witnesses. I think I have a list of them. I can't see it from here, but I think about a dozen or so of the witnesses have all been interviewed. Some of them might not make it to the final cut. I don't know. But they're going to say this happened, but who done it? What was it?
Who done
I'll
it?
leave it open-ended because we don't know. Calvin didn't know, know. And so hopefully that'll be finished. It's in the editing stage now, so hopefully that'll be out before the end of the year because it's the anniversary. It's the 50th anniversary this year.
I was just gonna say we're coming up on the anniversary of it, and I can't wait for that documentary because I'd love to.
Yeah, well, the working title for it, it's no secret, is called The Abduction of Calvin Parker. And it focuses mainly on Calvin because Calvin was, alive to be interviewed and so on. Charlie, you can't ask Charlie questions because he died in 2011. Right. But, we managed to access some very early archive film. Again, I hope they've used it. Literally within days of them seeing this thing, they're being interviewed and all kinds. I've sent them everything I've got, Tyler, and it's up to them. Maybe I've sent them too much. I don't know, but it's down to them what they choose to use, not me. I'm not telling them. Certainly, I've been interviewed. So was Dr.
I'm going to
Scott.
say you're in the film though, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Okay. Yes. I went to London and filmed my piece earlier this year. And I think that was the last piece to be done. So they're now editing it and we'll just, I'll come back to you when it comes out. Maybe get you a screener to maybe see it. I don't know.
Yeah, I would love to get a screener and be able to see it sooner. But be able to review it with you and do all that. Man, I mean, in Calvin right now, he's not in the best of health.
No.
As I hear it. So, if you do talk to him, give him, all of our best, and
Yeah. Well,
the
what is
work that
also,
you've done,
yeah. No, carry on. Sorry.
the work that you've done is, I mean, I hope that at least he's in a place where he's comfortable now, knowing that he's not the only one who saw something that night.
Yeah.
Far from it. And
Well,
he may have not.
he felt vindicated when
Yeah,
certainly when Mr. and Mrs. Blair stepped forward, and when they first stepped forward, by the way, they were only then admitting to seeing the blue lights. Everything else came later. But he felt
right.
then, then Mr. Lee and Mr. Anderson and others came forward, and he felt vindicated. It was like, I told you so. I told you so. I'll give you another. This is another little story. It's not in the book. It involves Charlie Hickson. About a year after the event, he was invited out to meet a gentleman by the name of Ray Stanford. Ray was he's an old UFO investigator. He was one of the earliest guys to look into the Socorro landing. He wrote a book on it, and he got he got him and his colleagues have got I think it was called Project Starlight International. They've got an old battery of equipment to try and view and record UFO sightings. So he invited Charlie Hickson out to see them. And they were chatting away this day, and whatever this place was, they had a UFO sighting. Of course, none of the equipment is switched on because they were just having a chat. And they were excited to actually see something. Right. And Charlie went, well, I told you. I told you, as if,
told you.
There you go, guys. There you go. And I wrote a little article about that because the guy, had a bit of artwork to go with it, Mr. Stanford, long-standing UFO researcher. But Charlie literally shrugged his shoulders and said, there you go.
There it is. That's all I got to say, right?
Yeah. What have I been telling you? Now you've seen it for yourself.
And I think that's another thing is people, there are a lot of people who have had sightings, but there's just as many, if not many more, that haven't. And it's not until you see or experience something or investigate something and really get into the nitty-gritty of it and you're convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. It's not until you get into this world that you really see, like, the world is not black and white. There's so much gray to it.
Yeah. I mean, now that, as we mentioned, Charlie became what we know as a contactee. He claimed to have messages from these beings later on. And he claimed that he had another UFO sighting complete with his family, all in the car. And what his son Eddie told us, again, Eddie, we did an interview with Eddie in the book. I said, was your father frightened, scared? He says, not later. He was at the time, but it was more my mother that was frightened because she was forever looking over her shoulder, thinking, is this going to happen again? And you can understand that. And I think you mentioned it. Calvin underwent hypnosis in 1993 with the late Bud Hopkins because Calvin had another experience that year.
Yeah, can you explain that one?
Well, Calvin went, it's not in the book, this bit, because we've concentrated on the 73 incident. So it's 20 years later. Guess what? He's going fishing on his own this time in a little boat. He says, Philip, I plan to go out for a couple of hours. That was it. So he said, I took some bottled water and a sandwich because I wasn't going to be that long. Parked the car up, out on the boat. And he fishing away. And he said he looked up and he saw this cloud and the cloud opened, and he retells being on board this thing. It's the same woman, he saw the same female he saw before
with the long finger.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
And various things happen, but this time he manages to get hold of her and he says, I'm looking for a door. And if I find a door, we're both going out of it. I don't care where we are. He said, I've had enough of this shit. And because
he's like, I'm bringing you to everybody.
Calvin was a tough guy, and so he beats the living daylights out of her. And he told his friend about this. So Calvin could remember it. Don't get me wrong. He remembered what had happened. When he got back to shore, of course, it was dark. He'd only possibly gone a couple of hours. His wife had been out looking for him, and she put a note under his windscreen wiper. Where the hell are you? You know?
My God.
Anyway, he told a friend, and this friend had a little bit of interest in the subject. And he says, Bud Hopkins is at a conference in Florida this weekend. Why don't we go and see him? Anyway,
he had the book, Missing Time.
Yeah, so they literally get in the car, they go to this conference, which is at a hotel. Calvin will not go in it. He doesn't want people to recognize him. His friend goes in, finds Bud, tells him what's what. Bud, being the lovely man that he was, and I knew him well, says, "Here's my hotel key room.
Come up
Take Calvin to the hotel room, and I'll see you later." Bud turns up, and he puts Calvin under hypnosis. And we found the tape. We have a recording of it. It's in an earlier book. So what Bud does, yes, he talks about this thing that happened in 1993, what happened in 1973, but he also, Calvin reports 2 encounters as a young boy, as a young fella.
Really?
And the common denominator in all 4 encounters is this female. She's the common denominator amongst it. We then discovered that Charles Hickson had been hypnotized by Bud Hopkins twice. One in 1985, I believe, and one in 89. So 2 different sessions. Calvin wasn't there. And I got the tapes of those. So they were both recorded. And again, Charlie had 2 encounters as a young fella. And we have all that, you know, I've had the tapes digitized. We published them previously. And what I'm going to be doing next year, Tyler, I'm going to put all these hypnosis transcripts in one book. So you can have them all, because they're scattered amongst 5 or 6 books at this moment. So I'm going to put them all in one. And I even found a little clip of Calvin, I think under hypnosis, I think on the day after the abduction, or 2 days after, when Dr. James Harder came. Okay. It's poor quality, but I've got a transcript of it. So that you know, and we got a tape of Charlie and Calvin being hypnotized by the late Dr. Leo Sprinkle as well in the past. Yes. I mean, I met Leo, I knew him. And so there's all this other information from other times relating to other things. We've concentrated on, in Beyond Reasonable Doubt, on the events in 1973 and things surrounding it. And so there is a big, like you said, there's a much bigger story, not just here in 1973, but with both gentlemen as well, in other events and other things that happened.
Let
me just tell you this one story before I forget.
Okay.
When Calvin underwent hypnosis with Bud Hopkins in 1993, I sent Calvin a digitized copy of the recording. He put it on a CD. Bear in mind, Calvin, had only recently told his wife what had happened.
Right.
And it took him a number of weeks before he plucked up courage to listen to it. And he sat on the porch one night. He had no idea what this said. No idea what was on the tape. And he played it with his wife with him. And I think Calvin could be the only abductee to get in trouble with his wife over something he says while under hypnosis. Because he says on the tape, "I'm having a drink of water and my wife has made me a bologna sandwich." And he says, "It's the most awful goddamn bologna sandwich you ever tasted in your life." And his wife went out and sat there. And they both cracked up laughing, And so every when the film crew were coming out last year, I said to Waynette, I spoke to her on Skype, I said, whatever you do, Waynette, don't make him a bologna sandwich, And she laughed like mad. She laughed
Oh
like
my
mad.
God.
So
That's so funny.
yeah, but it just shows you he's not making up a story. He's telling you what happened.
He's telling you his truth.
I've drunk my water. I've ate this sandwich, and it was god awful, and then on with the rest of the story. But yeah, it was a little funny thing because Calvin was, is quite a character, shall we say? Yeah,
he is. I don't know him personally, but through watching every interview he's ever done, I think he's humble, very humble.
He's a humble, honourable man. He didn't have a great school education, but he's not stupid by any stretch of the imagination.
Right.
And there's lots of, misadventures because he was moving from one town to the other, And there's some sad things as well. He felt at one point so hopeless, so traumatized that he phoned his insurance company up, his life insurance, and asked them if it was covered for, suicide.
Oh, Jesus.
And they said no. So he came up with this idea that his wife would be better off without him, but she needed the insurance money. She didn't know anything about this.
Of course.
So he went into a cowboy bar somewhere and picked a fight with half a dozen cowboys. And they beat they beat the living daylights out of him. And he was so, disorientated. He stumbled out of the bar, turned around and went back in, and they got him again, but they didn't kill him. And he told us this story, And but that's how this event affected
Changed
his
him.
life on a daily basis, And it did. It traumatized him for decades. And it was only by writing his book, telling the story once and for all out into the open, and it's there now for posterity. It's there.
Well, Phil,
it's there for everybody.
And there could be an argument made that you're the reason that he wrote the book.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to make you uncomfortable or anything, but you are essentially the bridge that allowed him to come out. And he said that he maybe told his wife, yeah, I'll do it. But he was probably never going to get to it. He just kind of wanted to please her at the time.
Yeah.
You called 2 weeks later, and then you put the pressure on a little bit. Tell your story. This is your legacy. People need to know. This
is what I said to him, Calvin. I said, look, the only thing you have control of is the book. If you do a documentary, it's out of your control. If you make a movie, it's out of your control.
Travis Walton found that out.
Yeah, the only thing you have control of is you tell the story yourself. And I will not edit it. I promised him. And everything we've done since then, I always sought Calvin's approval first. I said, there's this, these want to interview you. Yeah, and he said, I trust you, Philip. I said, it's not a matter of trust. You decide. And it worked well. And we became good friends. And, he was glad that he'd done it. And then he said, it's going to be there when we're all gone. The story is now told. Nobody can change it. It's there, ad infinitum. It's there for posterity. And
I love that.
It made him feel better. And it gave him a fresh lease of life. And he loved it.
Yeah. A bit of a fresh start.
Yeah.
You unpacked everything that he was holding in for that long. And it was just now it was all out there. It's like a weight off your shoulder, I can imagine.
Yeah, well, I'll give you one example. It was a speaking at a UFO conference somewhere, and he always wore the same baseball cap. It's got fishing on it. It's had it for years. It's black and it's got holes in it. Somebody said, I'll give you $200 for your fishing cap. And he looked at them as if they were nuts.
Right.
You can go buy the exact same fishing cap in the store for $10. But I said, yeah,
Nope.
Calvin, you can, but it wouldn't be your fishing cap. He said,
Right.
well, I wasn't wearing this at the time. I said, that doesn't matter, you know. And he couldn't get his head. It was just Calvin Parker, you know,
Right.
just an ordinary fella. He couldn't get his head around that. And I said, you have to understand that, Calvin. You know, people appreciate what you know, what you've had to say, and you know, and so they look upon you a little bit different. And I know one TV guy said to Calvin, if you speak at another conference, I don't care where it is in the United States, you let me know, and I'm coming just to meet you.
Good.
That is it. I'm coming just to meet you. I'm not bothered where it is. I'll come. And so, you know, he's had an effect on people that he's met and people who have read his book. You can't convince everybody, Tyler. The same with our book. There'll be people who are not convinced, and that's fine. You don't have a problem with that. But all the information we've gathered so far about the incidents in 1973 is in beyond reasonable doubt. You know, we've made it available. We are aware of the current economic situation. So the book is available in a very large hardback, which is the most expensive. It's then available in a 10x8 and a 6x9 inch paperback. So 2 different versions, different prices. Then a Kindle, which is even cheaper.
Yeah.
And the audio book, which you've listened to as well.
Yes.
So there's something for pretty much everyone, and hopefully for, you know, most people's wallets. And we were very aware of that, you know, when we were putting the finishing touches to the book. And so far, so good. You know, feedback's been very positive.
I mean, of course, for anyone who's listening to this, the links will be in the description below for you to purchase the book. They can purchase it on Amazon, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's also literally tomorrow. It also comes out in French and Spanish.
Beautiful.
So we'll have in English, French, Spanish, and that'll be there on Amazon. We've been speaking to an Italian publisher who may be interested, and they're not a huge publisher. It's not going to be a huge payday, because at the end of the day, we've put hours and hours of blood, sweat, and tears into this research over the last 5 years, and we just want to help Calvin leave that legacy. I mean, we've even worked with 2 gentlemen, a guy called Martin Powell, who's a writer, and another chap called Jason Gleaves, and they've done the most brilliant graphic novel on the Pascagoula case. It's out now. It's called UFO, you know, The Closest Encounter, by Moonstone Books. It's also available in the UK from the Forbidden Planet online. And again, it's about £8 or £9. I don't know what that is in dollars. Maybe $10 or $12.
Yeah, it's 10, 11
but
bucks.
But the reason we did it is because it takes it to a different audience. You know, it's Calvin and Charlie's story to a different audience.
Yeah, and Martin will be on the show actually right after you. So
there you go.
So they'll be able to. So not only, you know, are you telling the story, but Martin will be on next week. So that's going to be fantastic. And you've been very good about you know, sending us over you know, people to ask to be on the show. So God, I mean, Phil, I consider you a friend. I always enjoy our conversations, and when the documentary comes out, that'll probably be the next time we have you on, and I would definitely love to see that early. Thank you for everything that you do for this community. I mean,
my pleasure.
This story, this is one of the more credible, if not, it's got to be up there in the top 5 or 6 of the most credible.
You know, I don't like blowing my own trumpet. And, you know, we've been fortunate to work with Irina and Calvin, and a number of other people helped us along the way. They're all given credit in the book. They've all helped in a variety of ways. And I've also been a complete pain in the ass with a number of people, because I've pestered the living daylights out of them, you know. And that will continue, I'm afraid. I'm sorry. I'll apologize now in advance. But we just want to tell the story in the best way we can. And we think it's the best documented case of its kind.
I think
People may disagree, which is
agree.
fine, but and I don't have a big ego or anything like that, but it's just the way I think it is, and people can prove us wrong if they like. We've put all the information in there, Tyler. People can go and double check what we've done and what we've said, what documents that we've used, and so on. And they can do their own research. But if not, it's all there for them. It's all there in one place.
And I love that. So thank you. I mean, thank you again for spending your time here on Total Disclosure. And we just want to say again, thank you for all the work that you've put into this case and other cases, because this is not all. I mean, the Pascagoula case is not the only case that that you work on. I mean, you're a wealth of knowledge when it comes to the subject. So I always love getting to talk to you. And here's to many more conversations in the future, Phil. So, how can people get a hold of you, and how can they stay up to date with what you're doing and all that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm mainly on Facebook. I'm easy enough to find.
Yes.
I do post a few things on Twitter, but not a lot, if I'm honest. And of course, I have a little blog, although I don't blog anything. I just advertise our books on there, the latest interviews. When I have a link for this one, it will go on the blog so people can, read them, and they can contact me either by Facebook or there's a link on the blog, to find me. I may be across the Atlantic living in this strange land called Yorkshire with this funny accent, but I'm easy enough to find, I can assure you. I spoke to a journalist recently in Washington on the telephone, and he said, "I'm sorry, Philip, I can't understand what you're saying."
I see probably just because I speak to so many people in in the UK and Australia and all that. I've gotten so used to it at this point, and I've watched everything that you've ever done. So like I don't know. I understand you. So
well, you have to
communication
remember
barrier.
For example, when I got the Bud Hopkins tape of the hypnosis with Calvin, I've got a tape. It's a little cassette tape. So I've got it in the tape player and I've got my headphones on and I'm going to transcribe it. So here I am with my northern accent. I'm listening to Bud Hopkins talk in his New York accent. And then I've got Calvin Parker under hypnosis
with a southern accent.
With a Mississippi southern accent. And there were a couple of times I had to give in. I had to email Calvin and say, "What the hell is this? I don't know what this is." And he had to explain it to me, because I thought I haven't got this right.
There's no way I got that one right. Oh man, that's so funny because when you really think about it, you got your accent, your dialect, and your way of your English speaking, and then you got the New York, which is very, very it's a quick, really fast-paced English, and then the Southern, which is a long, drawn-out one. So it's you got a lot there, man. Oh man, but thank you so much for your time today, Philip, and I can't wait.
My pleasure.
I cannot wait to see that documentary. I really can't.
Well, you've got a digital copy of the book, yeah?
Yes.
Maybe you'll pass it on to the gentleman, Mr. Burchett. Maybe you'll pass a copy on to him, and let him have a read.
I will. Actually, you know what? That's a great idea.
There you go.
That is a great idea.
I don't want his contact details. I'll let you do it if that's all right.
Yeah. He actually literally told me to do things like that. He said, if there's anything you ever want me to know, just let me know. And you know how to get a hold of me now. So, yeah, absolutely. Because I think this case and Mario Woods one are the ones that I want to push harder on because they do involve abduction. They do involve to a degree, and then that's beside the point. But we need to start looking at this abduction phenomenon for what it is. It's happening. It's happened. We can't run away from it, and we can't cherry pick it out of the narrative of UFOs because it exists.
Yeah. And like I said before, if anybody out there has any information on the Pascagoula case or was an eyewitness to the events in 1973, please get in touch. In confidence if required. It's not a problem.
Absolutely. And if anyone needs to know how to get to reach Philip, let me know. I'll put you in touch with them, and we can get that rolling. So again, thank you, Phil, for joining us.
Pleasure.
And for everyone out there in the UFO world and whoever may be listening, we thank you. Make sure to leave a rating if you're listening on Spotify or Apple, and leave us 5 stars for all the stars in the sky. We are here and will always be here with the new guests, with new information, with new stuff. Just because, like I said in the intro today, Tom left the show, so unfortunately, it's going to be me solo for a while. I don't think I'm going to pick up another co-host because I like these one-on-one conversations a little bit more. But it is what it is. People come and go, but the goal remains the same, and the goal is to find the truth. So, thank you everyone out there for contributing your support to the show, and make sure you buy Beyond a Reasonable Doubt by Philp Mantle and Irina Scott, available now on Amazon, and available in multiple languages, and hopefully soon Italian, like Phil said. We'll see you next time.